land that once refused even a blade of grass now dreams of forests. In the sun-scorched soil of Burkina Faso, where dunes stretch further than hope itself, a voice rose against inevitability. That voice was Ibrahim Traoré. He did not accept that the desert should swallow his nation acre by acre, year by year. He did not accept that future generations would beg for crumbs of food where fertile fields once stood. Instead, he asked a question that sounded almost absurd. What if this wasteland could breathe again? It was not a speech in a palace, nor a decree whispered in air-conditioned halls. It was a call carried by calloused hands, by farmers, by children, by couples who planted trees on their wedding day as symbols of love and rebirth. What seemed impossible began to look like destiny. Yet the greater the dream, the harsher the test. What followed was a struggle between sand and seed, between despair and resilience. Do not look away. What comes next may change how we imagine the future of entire continents. Subscribe and walk with us into this story of defiance, dignity, and rebirth. The desert was not creeping, it was marching. Each year in Burkina Faso, thousands of acres of land disappeared beneath advancing dunes, as if swallowed by a silent tide. Fields where sorghum once grew turned into wasteland. Villages that depended on the earth found the earth slipping away. Hunger was not a fear for tomorrow. It was a shadow over every meal today. For a young leader like Ibrahim Traoré, the question was not abstract. It was immediate, urgent, and merciless. How do you stop a desert that knows no borders, no mercy, and no pause? Traoré's answer was radical in its simplicity. If the desert advanced one step, the people of Burkina Faso would advance two. He launched a vast campaign of reforestation, but he refused to call it a government program. He called it a national duty. A tree was no longer just a tree. It was sovereignty with roots. It was dignity planted in the ground. Families carried seedlings like torches of hope. Schools turned lessons into days of planting. Soldiers, workers, even couples on their wedding day took spades to the soil, ensuring that alongside their vows, a sapling would rise as a promise to future generations. The movement was contagious. Soon entire towns poured into the desert with young plants cradled in their arms. What began as policy turned into a festival of resilience. In dusty streets, children ran with buckets of water for the saplings. Old men bent with age pressed seeds into the ground with trembling hands. To plant was no longer charity. It was resistance. It was partnership with the future. It was proof that Burkina Faso refused to be erased. Within a short time, millions of trees were counted across the nation. Satellite images began to show patches of green breaking through the ochre dunes. For the first time, journalists wrote of the desert not as a conqueror, but as a contested frontier. Traoré's vision had caught fire, not in speeches, but in hands and hearts. The nation was not waiting for foreign aid. It was building its own harvest of hope. And yet the desert is patient. What the people of Burkina Faso did not know was that the sand had more weapons than they imagined. Winds tore across the plains, ripping seedlings from the soil before roots could grip. Storms buried fragile plants beneath dunes overnight. The very ground was poor, starved of nutrients, unable to feed even the bravest of shoots. After 2 or 3 years, entire stretches of newly planted forests lay silent, their trees dead or dying. Farmers who had sweated under the sun saw their labor vanish in the dust. Doubt returned, sharper than hunger. Could a people fight the desert, or was it always fated to win? And just when despair seemed certain, Traoré asked a question that would turn the story upside down. If living plants could not survive the desert, what if the dead could? The desert tested not just the soil, but the spirit of a nation. When millions of saplings failed to take root, when storms stripped them from the earth like fragile threads, despair swept across Burkina Faso. Farmers whispered that no human hand could hold back the Sahara. Families who had planted trees for their weddings now looked at bare patches of sand where their vows should have grown. Some said Traoré's dream was nothing more than a mirage, beautiful from a distance, cruel up close. The movement that had begun with joy risked collapsing into silence. But Ibrahim Traoré refused to surrender. He stood before his people and said, "The wounds of this land are deep, therefore the cure must be deeper. If the desert kills the living, then let the dead fight back." It sounded like madness. Yet it was the madness of vision. He called upon farmers to gather the remnants of past harvests, the brittle stalks, the withered stems, the plants that once nourished but now lay wasted. Instead of burning them or letting them rot, he ordered them to be arranged in patterns across the dunes, woven into squares like a giant chessboard laid over the desert floor. At first, people laughed. How could dead plants bring life? But when the winds came, something extraordinary happened. The straw barricades held the sand in place. The grains that once danced freely in storms now fell still, trapped behind walls of stalks. Within the squares, seeds were planted. Slowly, as the dead stalks decayed, they released nutrients back into the soil, transforming the barren sand into a cradle of fertility. Where once the desert had devoured, now it was forced to feed. The sight was unforgettable. In the blazing heat, lines of workers marched across the horizon, laying stalks with sweat-drenched hands, creating golden lattices that shimmered like a net cast over the earth. From above, it looked as though the desert had been stitched together, its restless body bound by the patience of human will. Within those small enclosures, green shoots began to appear. They did not vanish in the next storm. They stood. They grew. They turned patches of nothingness into beginnings of life. For the scientists who visited, the results defied belief. After only a few years, sand movement was reduced by 99%. The same winds that once stripped the earth bare now struck walls of straw and fell silent, as though the desert's wings had been clipped. Farmers who had lost hope began to return to the fields. For the first time, they harvested crops where dunes had ruled. In village squares, elders spoke of Traoré's method not as an experiment, but as a miracle written by calloused hands. Hope returned, not in speeches, but in the rustle of leaves where silence had reigned. What had seemed absurd, that death could nurture life, was now undeniable. And with each success, the people asked themselves, if such a simple method could tame the desert, what more could be done? Could this fragile victory grow into a revolution of survival? The answer would come not from tradition, but from machines. A fusion of vision and technology that promised to multiply what human hands had begun. When the first green shoots survived the storms, something greater than trees began to grow. A new rhythm entered daily life. Farmers who once walked into the fields with resignation now carried tools with anticipation. Women who had spent hours gathering firewood in shrinking forests discovered patches of shade returning closer to their villages. Children no longer saw the desert as an inevitable horizon. They saw it as a battlefield where their parents were winning ground. The economic effects rippled outward. With fertile patches returning, food security began to strengthen. Families that had once depended on imported grain could now cultivate sorghum, millet, and beans in soils revived by the straw grids. Markets that had been quiet began to fill again with baskets of produce. It was not abundance, but it was dignity. The dignity of feeding one's family from one's own soil. In the villages, people began to say, the desert retreats when our hands advance. Politically, the impact was just as powerful. The authority of Ibrahim Traoré grew not from speeches in the capital, but from the living evidence sprouting in the countryside. Leaders before him had promised aid, loans, and international partnerships, but little had reached the hands of farmers. Traoré's method was visible, tangible, and national. His insistence that every citizen plant trees each year turned governance into participation. The people no longer saw themselves as recipients of policy, they became the policy itself. International observers labeled it unusual, even radical. To them, it was strange to measure leadership not in currency or contracts, but in saplings and stalks. Yet for the citizens of Burkina Faso, it was proof that their leader was not waiting for salvation from abroad. He was building it with them, step by step. That is why many referred to the Ibrahim Traoré coup not only as a political shift, but as an ecological and social revolution. It was a coup not just against old regimes, but against the desert itself. The cultural dimension was equally striking. Planting trees became woven into rites of passage. Weddings, graduations, community festivals, all found space for the act of placing a sapling into the soil. A tree was not merely wood and leaves. It was memory. It was commitment. It was the sign that life continued despite hardship. In this way, the nation's struggle against the desert became a story told in daily rituals, passed from one generation to the next. Yet even amid success, questions remained. Could these methods survive climate change, with rising temperatures and unpredictable rainfall? Could local enthusiasm endure once the immediate victory slowed? And perhaps the most important, would political opponents or foreign powers accept a model of sovereignty that defied the old dependency on aid? These questions simmered beneath the surface, even as fields turned green. Still, the sense of ownership was undeniable. For the first time in decades, people looked at their government not with suspicion, but with guarded pride. The land was speaking, and it was saying that resilience could triumph. One villager, interviewed by a local journalist, captured it simply. "We once thought the desert was our master. Now we know it is our rival, and we can fight." And as the shoots spread and the desert fell silent, the world began to watch. Could this fragile miracle in a small, landlocked nation hold lessons for the rest of the planet? When the first international journalists arrived to witness the golden lattices stretching across the dunes, they struggled to believe what they were seeing. This was not the Burkina Faso the world had imagined, a land condemned to hunger, drought, and decline. Instead, it was a land rewriting its fate with stalks and seeds. Newspapers in Europe called Ibrahim Traoré Africa's environmental hero. African outlets hailed his vision as a green shield against climate catastrophe. For once, the headlines about Burkina Faso were not about instability, but about innovation. Regional organizations such as the African Union and ECOWAS began to take note. Delegations arrived to study the straw grid technique, asking if it could be adapted for Niger, Mali, or Chad. The European Union, often focused on migration flows from the Sahel, quietly acknowledged that greening the desert might address root causes more effectively than border patrols. Even in the United States, environmental commentators suggested that this small West African nation was offering a lesson larger than aid packages, that dignity and sovereignty could grow from the soil itself. The irony was sharp. For decades, Burkina Faso had been portrayed as dependent, vulnerable, and fragile. Now it was exporting ideas strong enough to challenge narratives across continents. The so-called Burkina Faso revolution was not fought with weapons, but with roots. It suggested that sovereignty could be defended not only on battlefields, but in the furrows of farmland, in the shade of young forests. And it forced the world to ask uncomfortable questions. If such results could be achieved with simple tools and determination, what excuse remained for nations with far greater resources? International recognition brought both admiration and unease. On the one hand, Burkina Faso was praised as a beacon of resilience in the Sahel. On the other hand, skeptics warned that such a model might embolden others to seek independence from aid structures long dominated by powerful states. Environmental NGOs applauded, while political analysts whispered of shifting alliances. What seemed at first a local agricultural story was becoming a geopolitical parable. The world was watching, but the question lingered. Could Burkina Faso not only inspire, but endure? The answer lay in the uncertain road ahead. The battle against the desert was never meant to end in a single season. What Ibrahim Traoré and his people had begun was not just an environmental project, but a roadmap for the future. The question now was simple yet immense. Where does this road lead? One path is bright. If the straw grid method continues to spread, Burkina Faso could transform from a symbol of scarcity into a laboratory of hope for the entire Sahel. Imagine Niger, Mali, and Chad adopting the same strategy. Each square of straw, a fortress against erosion. Each sapling, a soldier in the war for survival. The dream extends even further. What if the Sahara itself, long seen as an endless desert, began to sprout corridors of life? For scientists and visionaries alike, the idea is not fantasy but possibility. Yet the risks are real. Climate change is a relentless adversary. Rising temperatures, erratic rains, and intensifying storms threaten to undo years of labor in a single season. Without resources, without continued commitment, the fragile green belt could wither. Political pressures, both domestic and international, could also shift the nation's course. Some foreign powers may view Burkina Faso's self-reliance not as inspiration, but as defiance. Economic strain might tempt future leaders to abandon long-term resilience for short-term relief. Still, the opportunities outweigh the fears. Already discussions have begun on whether Burkina Faso could export not just crops, but knowledge. A new form of trade where the product is survival itself. International universities are studying the technique. Development agencies are reconsidering their models. In a world desperate for solutions to climate change, a small landlocked nation has carved out a seat at the table, not by asking for aid, but by showing results. For the people on the ground, however, the revolution remains personal. Each tree planted is shade for a child yet unborn. Each stalk laid in the sand is a shield against hunger. Each harvest is proof that resilience can be sown. They do not speak of global diplomacy. They speak of soil, sweat, and survival. And perhaps that is the true power of this story. It begins in the hands of farmers, but it echoes across continents. And so the journey of Burkina Faso stands at a crossroads. Will this fragile miracle become a permanent rebirth, or will the desert rise again? The answer lies not only in one nation's struggle, but in the choice of an entire continent, and perhaps the world. Burkina Faso's story is more than a tale of trees. It is a testament to human determination, to the courage of a nation that refused to bow before inevitability. Where once the wind devoured all hope, green shoots now emerge, fed by the hands of those who believed that the impossible could be made real. Ibrahim Traoré coup did not merely plant saplings. It planted confidence, resilience, and the conviction that sovereignty begins with action, not requests. The revolution he inspired, now called the Burkina Faso Revolution, is proof that a people united by purpose can reclaim both their land and their destiny. From the smallest village to the national capital, citizens witness that policy intertwined with participation creates power that no foreign aid can replicate. This is not charity. This is not a temporary program. This is a coup against despair, against resignation, against the notion that some lands are too barren to cultivate pride and productivity. Yet the journey is far from complete. The lessons of Burkina Faso echo beyond its borders. Other nations watching the green grids emerging from the sand are confronted with a challenge. Can they cultivate the same courage, the same discipline, the same faith in their people? The Ibrahim Traoré coup reminds the world that leadership is measured not by promises, but by the life one nurtures in the soil, the harvest one secures for generations, and the hope one restores where it was nearly lost. So look at the land and see not the desert, but possibility. Watch the green threads weaving through the sand and understand that a revolution can grow from patience, sweat, and collective vision. Subscribe and stand with us in sharing this story of dignity, hope, and rebirth. Comment your thoughts. If a small nation can turn deserts into harvests, what can your community achieve? The legacy of Burkina Faso is still being written. Yet one thing is clear: the Ibrahim Traoré coup has changed the narrative of an entire nation, and the Burkina Faso revolution offers a blueprint for those who dare to challenge the impossible. The seeds of change have taken root, and the world is watching as they grow.